10 Forgotten Tragedies. Most tragic events make a historical splash, and some become positively iconic: Pompeii, the Titanic, the Rwandan genocide, etc. Others, however, drop off the public radar almost immediately, or never really reach it. Historical memory is a tricky thing. An event can be horrific and devastating yet still rapidly recede into the mists of memory if conditions are right, or wrong. 10. The Rana Plaza Collapse. The deadliest structural failure accident in modern history occurred in April 2013, and you've probably never heard of it. The infamous Boston Marathon bombing occurred the week before and garnered much media coverage with its 3 deaths and hundreds of wounded. But the collapse of this Bangladeshi building was a tragedy of a different order of magnitude. 1,134 people were killed, with more than twice as many injured. Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, was home to the Rana Plaza structure, originally constructed to contain shops and offices. Yet multiple upper floors were added on, without a permit, in order to house the heavy machinery for multiple clothing factories. These factories manufactured goods for such prominent brands as Benetton, Prada, Gucci, and Versace and employed around 5,000 people. Few, if any, of them knew they were working in a top-heavy death trap. 9. The Spanish flu. It seems absurd to describe a worldwide pandemic with a 50 million-plus death toll as forgotten. Indeed, in its day, the effect was very widely felt. Yet the strange aspect here is now little of a historical footprint this rampaging illness made. It seems to disappear into distant memory very quickly. It was certainly a sledgehammer blow at the time. A nasty strain of the influenza virus had developed among the trench-bound soldiers of World War I and traveled with them as they journeyed home. It was an ugly parting shot from that devastating war. Each stricken locale blamed it on somewhere else, hence the Spanish flu moniker. Spaniards called it the French flu, even though epidemiologists have never been able to determine a ground zero for the virus. 8. The Vaal Reefs mine disaster. Another modern disaster, this time in South Africa, is notable less for its death toll, at 104 deaths, the smallest on this list, than for its extremely bizarre circumstances. It combines the worst aspects of a mining disaster, an elevator failure, and a locomotive crash. Mining is a major industry in South Africa, and some of the mines there are truly massive. The company Anglo Gold Ashanti maintains a large gold mine in the town of Vaal Reefs, so huge that internal locomotives are used to move workers, machinery, and ore back and forth on different lateral levels. These levels are, of course, served by vertical shafts that connect them to the surface and to one another. On May 10, 1995, 104 night shift workers were going up the number 2 shaft in a large elevator cage, ready to head home. They never got there. Above them, in circumstances that remain unclear, a driver lost control of a locomotive and jumped clear. Switches designed to stop the engine if it was driverless failed, and multiple safety barriers could not stop the accelerating vehicle. It broke through and plunged straight downward, landing square on the ascending elevator. The winch cable broke instantly, and the 2 vehicles plunged together for 460 meters, 1,500 feet, all the way to the bottom of the shaft. 7. The Aberfan disaster. Continuing the theme of bizarre mining disasters brings us to Wales in the 1960s. There, a mining catastrophe claimed the lives of 144 people, all of them above the ground. The Welsh village of Aberfan is nestled in a valley overlooked by a coal-rich mountain range. In 1966, it had a population of 5,000, most of them employed in the coal mines. Looming directly over the streets was a spoil tip, a heap of waste material removed during the mining process. The British National Coal Board had approved the location of the tip, despite its proximity to the town. The problem was that heaps of spoil are inherently less stable than virgin rock and vulnerable to liquefying after becoming saturated with water. Ominously, the tip was located over a natural spring, whose presence was well known to the NCB. On the morning of October 21, Aberfan had just received 3 weeks of historic rainfall. miners had just noticed slippage along the surface of the tip. And Panglis Junior High School, less than 900 meters, 3,000 feet, away, had just started classes for the day. With booming thunder, roughly 110,000 cubic meters, 3.9 million ft3, of spoil slurry began sliding down the mountain, a rapid half-flood, half-avalanche that engulfed the western edge of the village. Outlying farmhouses were obliterated, broken water mains added to the flow, and the school was swamped with debris. The choking, stinking mass flooded into the classrooms, flowing swiftly through doors and windows and quickly resolidifying into the solid matter once it stopped moving. 6. The Victoria Hall Stampede. While we're in Great Britain, we can examine an earlier disaster of similar scope and horror. Here, too, children were the primary victims, and the primary factor. The only avalanche at Victoria Hall was a human one. In the summer of 1883, Victoria Hall, a theatre in Sunderland, England, was hosting a children's variety show. More than 1,000 children aged 3 to 14 were in attendance, many in the upstairs gallery seats. All was going well until the end of the show, when the entertainers began passing out prizes to some children in the audience. Those in the gallery were worried about missing out, so they started to run. However, the door at the bottom of the staircase opened inward, and worse, it had been bolted mostly shut, leaving a gap so small that only one child could pass through at a time. This measure was apparently intended to ensure that tickets could be properly checked. It made the staircase a death trap. 5. The Great Smog of London. Alongside stampedes, avalanches, and locomotive crashes, air pollution sounds unimpressive as a culprit for disaster. Even those who are aware of the problems of poor air quality tends to think of it as a low-rate or slow-motion problem. But such pollution managed to rack up extreme casualties in the capital of England in 1952. Londoners are used to fog, but in early December of that year, the residents noticed an unusually dense, yellow-black cloud settling over everyone and everything. People could barely see in front of their faces. Many compared the experience to being blind. Walking out of doors meant shuffling along with hands outstretched, feeling for obstacles. For 4 days, public transportation ground to a halt, ambulance service was suspended, and even events in large interior spaces were cancelled, as the smog penetrated within. 4. The Ohio Penitentiary Fire. If hundreds of people burned to death in your average government facility, you'd get a ton of headlines. But if these people are involuntary guests of the state at a prison, those headlines will be converted to footnotes with disquieting speed. The overcrowded 4,300 prisoners had just been locked in their cells on the evening of April 21, 1930, when a misplaced candle started a fire on the roof of one of the main cell blocks. The criminals, trapped before an advancing conflagration, clamored to be let out and allowed to save themselves. Some guards responded in a humanitarian fashion and unlocked cell doors, but many more refused to do so. As the human drama unfolded, the fire only grew. One narrow survivor remembered, "There was nothing to do but scream for God to open the doors. And when the doors didn't open, all that was left was to stand still and let the fire burn the meat off and hope it wouldn't be too long about it." Some men began killing themselves rather than be cooked alive. 3. The Saline Tunnel Incident. Our next calamity combines noxious gases, fire, and military silence. It is so shrouded in secrecy that details are sketchy, even nearly 40 years after the fact. In 1982, Soviet military forces in Afghanistan were embroiled in a seemingly never-ending war with fierce local resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. Hindered by extremely inhospitable geography, the campaign saw units constantly compromised by their isolation and the surrounding terrain. At the frigid Saline Pass in the Hindu Kush mountain range, a terrain improvement, a 2.7-kilometer, 1.7 miles, road tunnel, became the scene of a disaster. All analyses agree that a Soviet military convoy was moving south through the tunnel on November 3, 1982, and that some fatal crisis occurred. Here, the accounts diverge. Some say a fuel tanker exploded, due either to a traffic accident or a mujahideen attack, though local insurgents denied any role. Others say there was no explosion, only a traffic jam when two convoys tried to pass one another. But all accounts report that deaths began occurring rapidly thereafter. 2. The SS Leopoldville. Continuing the military secrets angle. RMS Titanic sinking was so disastrous, in part, because of its remote location. More people could have been saved, if only there had been sufficient, and attentive, ships nearby. But a generation later, another ship went down with major casualties in the center of one of the world's busiest sea lanes, the English Channel. And almost no one at the time heard about it. It was Christmas Eve 1944. Rather than tucking themselves in for a long winter's nap, however, men of the U.S. 66th Infantry Division were hurrying aboard a Belgian transport ship, the SS Leopoldville. The ongoing Battle of the Bulge was in full-on crisis mode, and the 66th was part of the reinforcements being rushed to the front. Everything about the operation was hasty. The disorganized loading of the men, the poor excuse for a lifeboat drill, and the totally insufficient number of life jackets. When a surviving German U-boat launched 2 torpedoes at the Leopoldville just before 6 p.m., the stage had already been set for a disaster. 1. The SS Kapparkina. What could be worse than a boatload of soldiers drowned before they ever got the chance to fight? How about 2 boatloads of concentration camp survivors sunk by their own would-be rescuers? In the choppy waters of the Baltic Sea on May 3, 1945, 4 German means of transport were steaming hard for Norway. Even as the Third Reich collapsed into ash, the architects of the final solution were sticking to their tasks. To that end, they loaded nearly 10,000 concentration camp prisoners aboard several vessels, including the converted ocean liner SS Kapparkina. Forebodingly, the ship had seen prior use as an on-location set for the Nazi propaganda film Titanic, 1943. The decks of the Kapparkina, so recently used to reenact a dreadful sinking, were about to experience the real thing. Allied forces, having received word that high-ranking Nazi SS officials were attempting to flee to neutral territory in Scandinavia, were eager to prevent this. Citing the German prison flotilla, whose ships were not marked to signify their purpose, with prisoners locked out of sight below decks, British spotters assumed they were fair game and called in the fighter bombers. The fat, slow, unprotected German ships made easy targets.